Paul's letter to the Galatians. Truth 23. The traditional interpretation of Galatians misreads the purpose of Paul's letter. When initially presented with the case for Torah relevancy, the first place I turned to was the book of Galatians. Along with Romans, I once considered Paul's epistle to the Galatians to be the strongest argument supporting antinomian grace. So as we turn our attention to Paul's letters, let's begin here. Open to the book of Galatians in any study Bible. In the preface, you will find a short synopsis of the letter. This contains information about the author, audience, time, background, occasion, and outline of the book. Regarding authorship, there is no real dispute. The writer of Galatians is clearly Shaul of Tarsus, as Paul identifies himself in the opening verse. There is some debate on the intended audience and destination of Galatians, which influences when the letter is believed to have been written. A general timetable places the epistle close to the events of Acts 15, which some speculate occurred roughly 49 to 50 CE. If written to the churches of the southern region of Galatia, it was likely penned just before or perhaps shortly after the decision of the Jerusalem Council. If so, Paul would have written Galatians while in Syrian Antioch following his first missionary journey. If written to the churches in northern Galatia, a much later date is preferred. The date of Galatians deserves consideration. Addressed to the southern churches, Galatians would have been the first of Paul's biblical epistles. If addressed to the northern churches, Galatians would have been written later in Paul's ministry, perhaps more than a decade after the decision of the Jerusalem Council. Some feel that because Paul's appeal makes no specific mention of the ruling of the Jerusalem Council, a pre-Acts 15 date is desirable. The difference of opinion usually hinges upon how Paul's trip to Jerusalem in Galatians chapter 2 is viewed. If chapter 2 is recounting the same trip to Jerusalem that Paul took with Barnabas in Acts 15, Galatians would have been penned after the decision of the council. If not, an earlier date is preferred. Regarding the audience, there is little doubt that the region of Galatia was primarily Gentile. Certainly some Jews lived in the area. A small representative of believing Jews could have been among the churches, but for the most part, these believers were predominantly Gentile. Paul's letter to the Galatians clearly addresses Gentile issues with a primarily Gentile audience. After determining the time, authorship, and background, we turn to the purpose of the epistle. In most introductions and commentaries, something along these lines is written when discussing the occasion of Paul's letter. Judaizers were infiltrating this Gentile community of believers, insisting that converts adhere to Old Testament laws, including circumcision. These legalists were trying to bring the Galatian Christians under the yoke of the Old Covenant by forcing them to obey Mosaic law. When Paul learned that the Galatians were already yielding to this bondage by observing Sabbath, feasts, new moon festivals, and circumcision, he reaffirms that life and freedom in the Spirit is by faith and not through the law. He emphatically argues that a person is saved by grace through faith, and insists that mixing grace with the law produces legalism. Any regression into the requirements of the law is evidence of being bewitched, living in the flesh, and operating under a curse. He reassures his Gentile audience that Christ came to free them from mandated yokes of slavery to the law. Galatians is Paul's strongest and most impassioned rebuke of Torah keepers. This introduction to Galatians is typical and unfortunate because most Christians rely on these kinds of study notes to help them understand the Bible. The intent of Paul's letter, however, is not without dispute. Luther's Reformed idea about Galatians, the interpretation uniformly taught today, is not without its deficiencies. A growing number of scholars are calling for and supporting an alternative view of Galatians. This is what I am presenting here. Conclusion. In this section, I will put forth an historically and hermeneutically sound interpretation that stands in contrast to the widely accepted interpretation of Galatians. I am convinced that the traditional interpretation of Galatians misses the plain meaning of Paul's letter. I aim to establish a more precise premise in order to draw a more accurate conclusion.